Chapter 1. The world, for centuries, had been a tapestry woven from the brittle threads of forgotten oaths and the relentless, suffocating press of the cold. Here, at the precipice of the northern wastes, where the ancestral lines of the old blood were thinnest, the cold was not merely an absence of heat. It was a hungry, watchful entity. It bled the life from the stone and the man alike, leaving behind only the gray ash of memory. This was the burden Lord Cassian bore, the eternal weight of his merciful curse, a life spent safeguarding what he most despised, the fragile, flickering candle of humanity. His vigil was held within the ruinous, magnificent shell of Oakhaven Manor, a skeletal monument of black marble and slate that clawed against a sky perpetually bruised with twilight. The high, mullioned windows of the study, now frosted with the crystalline breath of the winter siege, offered him a view of the village below. A cluster of huddled, timber-framed lives, their chimneys exhaling thin, desperate plumes of smoke. The silence in the manor was a living thing, broken only by the crackle of the hearth, a roaring, necessary blaze that fought a losing battle against the stone's pervasive chill. Cassian, carved from the same flawless, pale marble as the manor's balustrades, stood motionless. His stillness was not rest. It was the coiled, lethal tension of an ancient predator waiting. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea where the deep water meets the light, were fixed on the hearth, yet his mind was 1,000 years away, replaying the folly and the failure that had bound him to this impossible, sacrificial existence. He was the Kidan, the firstborn of a covenant broken before its ink had dried, the shepherd of a flock whose scent was both his salvation and his eternal, gnawing torment, the scent of her. It was a new variable in his stagnant, immortal equation, a subtle, almost imperceptible sweetness beneath the common fear and the raw peasant musk of the village. It had been his singular focus for the last 2 days, an unseen, unheard song that promised a quiet, profound devastation. Ilara. They had brought her to him like a desperate, sacrificial lamb, dragged her from the cellar of the village elder, and thrust her toward the manor gates, believing the myth of the Kidan's hunger was the only currency that might buy their survival. The siege of the first winter, they called it now, a ridiculous, overblown title for the slow, inevitable creep of the Vrikalakas, the feral, lesser strains of his own lineage, driven mad by the deepening, unnatural cold and the scent of 100 untouched lives. Cassian had dismissed the villagers with a low, guttural command, the sound itself a physical wave that drove them backward into the snow. He had not taken the girl. Not yet. She was too profound a complication. He had merely observed from the shadowed balcony the moment they had abandoned her at the edge of his property. The girl hadn't cried. That was the first note in her unique, unsettling melody. Where others wept, she stood, head bowed, a small, dark shadow against the white. And when she finally looked up, her eyes, a startling, fierce amber, held not terror, but a conviction that felt too old, too absolute for her 16 years. She was now in the manor's oldest chamber, the guest wing facing the ironwoods, a room kept meticulously free of dust by the manor's single ancient retainer, yet still steeped in the overwhelming melancholy of the long abandon. Cassian walked now, his footsteps soundless upon the polished basalt floor. He moved with a liquid grace, a chilling economy of motion that spoke of power used so infrequently it had been perfected into a form of lethal poetry. The poetic language that defined the world outside now centered entirely upon her presence. He felt the shift, a tightening in the ancient dead core of his being. He was meant to be the Kidan, the unfeeling sentinel, but the air around her felt charged, resonating with a power that wasn't solely human. It tasted like raw prophecy, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the cold, clear scent of a mountain spring, a combination that should be impossible. He paused outside the heavy, carved oak door. The burden will not break you, only anchor you to the purpose. His father's last words, a hollow echo in his immortal memory. But this girl, this child, felt like she could shatter the anchor and set the whole ship of his damned existence adrift. His guilt, the heavy cloak he wore, stemmed from the simple, terrifying fact that he could not save all of them. He had long ago made his peace with choosing the few over the many, the necessary evil over the devastating good. But this choice felt different. It felt mandated. He pushed the door inward without knocking. The room was illuminated only by a single oil lamp on a nearby escritoire. Elara was sitting on the edge of the large canopied bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, facing the door. She wore a simple patched dress, but she held herself with a dignity that was wholly unexpected. Her amber eyes found his instantly, refusing to shy away from the spectral intensity of his gaze. She was small, slight, but in her stillness, she seemed to command the entire vast room. Cassian moved into the center of the room, allowing the light of the lamp to catch the high, sharp angles of his face, the almost too beautiful, chiseled perfection that marked him as something inherently not of this world. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant baritone, a sound of earth and buried stone, formal and utterly devoid of warmth. They offered you as tribute, child. He did not phrase it as a question. They believe that my hunger, once sated, will turn me against the Vrikolakas. They believe I am a monster that can be bartered with. He waited, the silence stretching taut between them. The wind outside groaned, a deep, mournful sound mimicking the ancient politics that had brought them to this ridiculous precipice. Elara finally spoke, her voice surprisingly steady, though pitched low, intimate against the vast silence. I know what they believe, Lord Cassian. She did not use the local, fearful title, Kaidan. I offered myself. His inhuman stillness wavered, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his cold eyes. Why? He asked. The question was a challenge, a demand for the truth. The price of their survival is not yours to set. She unfolded her hands and looked directly at him. They would have starved eventually, even if the cold did not take them first. This year's harvest was ash. Her words were sparse, purposeful. The Vrikolakas would have come whether you intervened or not. My blood is a temporary measure, yes, but it would have bought them time to reach the south before the deepest snows settled. She tilted her head, a gesture of quiet, firm defiance. I do not fear death, Lord. I fear the death I cannot prevent. The raw conviction in her voice was like a physical blow, a sudden rush of warmth into the ancient ice of his heart. It was a philosophy he understood, a dark, necessary choice. It was the echo of his own original sin. And you believe my intervention, my mercy, is something that can be purchased with the brief span of your mortal life? Cassian took a single, deliberate step closer. The air in the room seemed to cool further. The scent of her blood, the blood he should be desiring, was now overshadowed by the overwhelming electrical charge of her spirit. This was not the frightened, broken quarry he expected. This was a conviction so immense it was nearly a weapon. He saw the faint, almost forgotten symbol etched into the collarbone of her dress, a small, intricate knotwork of silver and obsidian thread, the sign of the Covenant of the Watchful Star, a nearly extinct esoteric order devoted to chronicling the prophecies of the old blood. His mind, which held the memory of every breath of his 1,000 years, raced. You are one of the chroniclers. He didn't ask. He stated the fact with sudden, cold certainty. The bloodline of the seers. The truth clicked into place, rearranging the pieces of the puzzle with brutal finality. Her conviction wasn't a choice, it was a destiny. Elara's gaze did not drop. She was cornered, her secret revealed, but she held the posture of a sovereign. My name is Ilara of the Line of Sol. The prophecies concerning the Khadan and the Ironwood siege are known to me." She used the formal, ancient terminology, the language style shifting instantly from the merely formal to the formal, scholarly. The villagers only saw a sacrifice. I saw a necessary anchor. She rose slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You cannot refuse the prophecy, Lord. It is written that the Khadan will find his anchor during the deepest siege, and that the blood offered by the seer will not be taken, but shared, to break the covenant that binds the lesser blood." Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper, suddenly intimate. "You will not turn me away, because the moment you do, the Vrkolakas will take the manor, and the covenant that has held the old blood in relative stasis for centuries will be irrevocably broken. Your guilt, Lord, will finally become oblivion." She was daring him, weaponizing his ancient trauma and self-hatred against him. Cassian's face remained impassive, an exquisite mask of cold indifference, but the storm in his eyes deepened into a turbulent vortex. He was the Khadan, defined by his burden and his loneliness, and now a slip of a girl had arrived, speaking in the language of prophecy and ancient politics, demanding he choose not merely to save lives, but to fundamentally alter the nature of his own eternal existence. The pacing of the scene shifted, the slow burn attention igniting into a sudden, high-stakes confrontation. The air was thick with destiny, and the dramatic reality of their confrontation was undeniable. He finally allowed himself a small, terrible smile. Prophecy, child, is merely a story told by those too afraid to make their own choices. His voice was laced with a dark, weary irony. I despise stories. I deal in consequences. He took the final step, closing the distance between them until he towered over her, his immense physical presence overwhelming the room. The sensory details were sharp, the scent of his old leather, the cold, almost mineral scent of his skin, and the faint, coppery tang of the eternal hunger that he kept meticulously leashed. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and perfectly shaped, and gently touched the intricate knotwork at her throat. "Show me." It was a quiet, potent demand, a challenge to her conviction and her lineage. "Show me the proof that your life is worth the price of my attention, Ilara of the Line of Sol. Show me the vision that anchors your arrogance." The moment was intense, fiercely protective on his part, a primal urge to test the limits of what she was offering, and it was rooted deeply in his sense of guilt and the profound loneliness of his immortal existence. This was the hook, the immediate immersion in the protagonist's trauma and the sudden introduction of the otherworldly guardian. Chapter 2. The knotwork at Ilara's throat felt suddenly scalding beneath the unnatural coldness of his touch. It was a physical jolt, a jarring sensation that resonated not on her skin, but deep within the fragile architecture of her hidden power. The coldness of his fingers was absolute, the temperature of grave marble, yet their contact did not repel her. Instead, it felt like the grounding point for a tremendous, uncontrollable energy waiting just beneath her human surface. She felt the sudden, involuntary surge of her gift, the raw current of prophetic sight that always felt like an internal, silent scream. Her small body, already exhausted by fear, and the 2 days of enforced fasting the villagers had inflicted upon her to prepare the sacrifice, went rigid. The atmosphere in the massive, draft-ridden room condensed, the single oil lamp's light flickering wildly as if struggling against a supernatural vacuum. Cassian watched, his eyes narrowed, the fierce amber of her gaze suddenly blurring, refocusing on an unseen horizon. The omniscient third-person POV shifted tightly into his close third-person perspective, providing deep insight into his analytical, immortal mind. He saw the subtle, almost instantaneous change in her, the way her breathing became shallow and rapid, the sudden, seismic intensity of her internal state. She was not merely remembering a prophecy, She was experiencing it. The language style became immediately highly descriptive, focusing on her internal state and the otherworldly manifestation of her gift. Alara's vision was a sudden, violent displacement. The stately, melancholic room vanished, replaced by a brutal, sensory overload. She was submerged in a tableau of ash and crimson, the overwhelming smell of ozone and burnt wood, the terrifying sound of stone fracturing under immense magical pressure. She saw the manor, not as its present skeletal self, but utterly engulfed in a hellish pyre, the black marble running with liquid fire. The most arresting detail was the absence of the Kaidan. Cassian was not there. Instead, the walls were patrolled by hulking, shadow-veiled creatures with eyes of pure, malevolent red, the Vrkolicas unbound, their bloodlust a tangible, suffocating weight. But the true horror was centered on the small village below. She saw the snow turn to dark mud, stained with the indelible mark of true annihilation. The covenant was not merely broken, it was erased. The lesser blood was free, their feral, desperate hunger unleashed upon the world, and there was no anchor left to hold the line. The vision shifted again, becoming intimate and terrifyingly focused. She saw a single hand, her own, floating in the void, not bleeding, but radiating a dull, amber light, desperately trying to clutch at a shard of black, polished marble. The voice of the prophecy, a cold, dry whisper that was the culmination of 1,000 forgotten generations, echoed in her mind. The seer's blood is the key. The Kaidan's choice is the chain. If the covenant breaks, the seer will be consumed, becoming the conduits for the final reckoning. She saw herself not as Alara, but as a burning effigy, a beacon of raw, untamed power that was immediately, violently exploited by the newly freed ancient darkness. She was not simply dying, she was being used as the catastrophic fuel for a world-ending event. The withdrawal from the vision was sharp, a gasping physical wrench back into the freezing reality of the room. Alara stumbled, her hand flying up to cover the knotwork at her throat. She was shaking now, not from fear, but from the immense exertion of the vision. The sensory details were immediate. The sudden, paralyzing cold of Cassian's hand still resting lightly on her shoulder, having moved there to steady her. The scent of his skin, cold as granite, and smelling faintly of petrichor and ancient dust-laden silk. She looked up at him, her amber eyes wide and burning with the terrible truth. "They take the manor, Lord," she whispered, her voice rough. "They take the covenant, and my death is not a sacrifice, it is the trigger." She leaned into the severity of the language, her prophecy-induced conviction absolute. The lesser blood is bound by the Kaidan's power. If you are not present, if you are not anchored, the binding fails. My line, the chroniclers, we are the stabilizers. If we are taken by the lesser blood, the energy of the prophecy releases us from the bond entirely. It is not freedom they gain, but a final, destructive mercy. The reckoning. She saw the skepticism, the ancient, ingrained cynicism in his eyes, but she pressed the point, her voice gathering strength, fiercely protective of the future she had just glimpsed. Cassian withdrew his hand. The stillness returned, but it was now a silence heavy with contemplation, not merely emptiness. He stepped back, returning to his position of immense formal distance, forcing the dialogue to become high value and sparse. The reckoning is a children's fable, seer, a tale told by your ancestors to frighten the old blood into piety. His dismissal was swift and cold. He was testing her, looking for the human weakness, the lie, the self-serving narrative. His guilt and self-hatred often manifested as a profound suspicion of anything that promised salvation or purpose. Your visions are colored by your own fear. You see what you believe is necessary to coerce the monster into action. He used the word monster deliberately, an act of dark, self-deprecating irony, to gauge her reaction. He was a being defined by his duality, the powerful mercy that warred with his inherent predatory nature. Alara met his scrutiny with a look of immense quiet despair, not at his rejection, but at his self-imposed blindness. You are the Kidan, Lord. You hate what you are, so you refuse to acknowledge the power that binds you to its opposite. You are defined by your burden. She used the thematic words with deliberate repetition, driving her message home. The covenant fails not because you are weak, but because you are isolated. Your loneliness is the flaw in the shield. The prophecy states, the Kidan must choose an anchor, a binding by will, not by hunger, to redefine the covenant. The blood is not for consumption, it is for the oath of the deep heart. She spoke of ancient languages and terminology, a depth of world building that transcended mere human knowledge. I offered myself, Lord, not as a meal, but as the only choice that prevents the ultimate failure of your 1,000-year vigil. Her words forced the internal conflict of the protagonist, trust, choice, into the foreground. Cassian walked to the frost-coated window, turning his back to her, presenting the severe, unmoving profile of a man carved from ice. He was taking the time he needed to process the terrifying implications of her narrative. The sensory overload of the cold returned, mixing with the scent of his own profound melancholy. If your vision is true, the cost of this anchor is my final surrender to the ties of the mortal world. He spoke to the window, to the vast indifferent darkness outside. My existence is one of necessary distance. I am the wall, not the foundation. To bind myself by will is to risk the catastrophic emotion that destroyed my lineage in the first place. He was referring to the ancient guilt that was the core of his being. He finally turned back, the sheer magnitude of his internal struggle visible only in the turbulent depths of his eyes. Tell me the terms of this oath of the deep heart. He had shifted from outright rejection to cautious, high-stakes negotiation. The tone was still Gothic, high-stakes and dramatic, but also deeply intimate. Alara felt a sudden, fierce flicker of hope. She had won the first crucial battle. She stepped toward him, her small form utterly resolute. The oath requires a full sharing of power, an intentional binding of the Kidan's immense glacial strength with the seer's raw, volatile sight. She laid out the rules of the supernatural world with clinical precision. Your immortality is not a blessing. It is a profound loneliness. The oath is a correction. I give you my blood, not to drink and sustain you, but to allow me access to the locus, the ancient magical center of the manor where the original covenant was forged. I become the living locus, and in return, you give me your choice. She stressed the word, making it the central pillar of the negotiation. You choose to be anchored, to trust the bond, and to fight not for the preservation of the covenant, but for the redefinition of it. The Vrikolakas are your bound kin, Lord. To redefine the covenant is to offer them a new, terrifying choice, submission to the newly anchored Kidan or oblivion. Cassian listened, his expression a study in contained fury and weary resignation. The political thriller aspect of the narrative was now fully engaged. This was a negotiation for the fate of his lineage and the world. And your role, Alara of Sol, he pressed, after this oath is sworn, you are not simply a conduit. The rhetorical devices focused on the inhuman stillness of the vampire. He saw the necessity, but not yet the full terror of his surrender. She was demanding his self-loathing be replaced by a terrifying, exposed hope. My role is to be your anchor, she stated simply, using the key thematic word. To hold the moral line you have long ago forgotten. To ensure that your immense power is used not for mere, isolated preservation, but for the necessary act of brutal mercy. You can shatter them, Lord, but only if you are willing to shatter your own self-hatred in the process. Her voice was quiet, intensely vulnerable now, the high stakes of her personal sacrifice laid bare. You will gain a purpose greater than your burden, and I will gain a reason for the sight that has isolated me my entire life." The quiet hope was palpable in her words. The sudden, brutal action was the decision itself, the leap of faith across the centuries-old chasm of his guilt. Cassian closed his eyes for a long, still moment. The only sound was the fierce crackle of the fire downstairs. When he opened them, the coldness was still there, but a decision had solidified, a sharp, terrible resolve. The poetic language emphasized the contrast between light and shadow. "You are asking for a political shift in the old world that will invite the attention of powers far beyond the rabid Vrikolakas." His voice was low, resonant with the true cost of her request. "The elder houses will come for you, Alara. They will see you as a threat to the established order." His fierce protective nature was now exposed, a sudden, powerful surge of intent. "If I agree, the manor will become a fortress, not merely against the siege of the cold, but against the ancient, jealous kings of my own blood. And your life, which you were so willing to relinquish, will now be bound to my eternal, high-stakes war." He held out his hand, the gesture formal, final. "I accept the terms. Show me the locus. We swear the oath of the deep heart before the first true assault on the walls begins." The dialogue was impactful, a final, world-changing information transfer. The consequence of his agreement was an immediate, profound escalation. The close-up focus on physical contact, the joining of their hands, was the only required action. Alara did not hesitate. Her small, warm hand met his cold, perfect one, and the two figures, the burdened immortal and the isolated prophet, stood bound by a terrible, fiercely protective, new covenant. Chapter 3. The journey to the locus was a descent into the manor's buried past, a physical and metaphorical plunge into the ancient guilt that was the foundation of Cassian's life. He led Alara through a labyrinth of forgotten, winding passages, their walls lined with black basalt and perpetually slick with a cold, mineral dampness that smelled of deep earth and undisturbed time. His hand, still clasping hers, was a startling contrast. Cold, powerful, and utterly steady, the anchor she had promised him. For Alara, the touch was a constant, almost overwhelming sensory experience. The close third-person POV again prioritized her internal state, the raw perceptions of the seer. She felt the depth of his power through the contact, a colossal, terrifying stillness that was nonetheless imbued with a deep, silent well of weary mercy. This duality of his character, powerful mercy, and ancient guilt, was the core of the supernatural romance. They reached a set of massive, bronze-bound doors, completely unadorned and set flush into the rock face. Cassian released her hand only long enough to press a series of faint, nearly invisible runes etched into the bronze. The air immediately thickened, the silence intensifying until it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. A low, grinding sound of stone against stone echoed through the passage, and the doors slowly, reluctantly, retracted into the walls. The scene was steeped in dark academia and Gothic fantasy imagery. The locust chamber was not vast, but it was profoundly imposing. It was a perfect octagon, hewn entirely from a single vein of pure, star-flecked obsidian. In the exact center stood a shallow, circular basin carved from a block of polished ancient yew, and above it, suspended on a single, taut chain of woven iron, hung a massive crystalline sphere that pulsed with the faintest internal light, the color of old, dried blood. This was the covenant stone, the heart of the old blood's binding oath. The air here was strangely warm, thick with the scent of ozone and iron, and resonant with an almost inaudible, constant hum, the sound of millennia of trapped magic. This is where my sire, the first Kaidan, made his error. Cassian's voice was low, formal, echoing with a profound self-hatred. He believed that his sacrifice, the consumption of the human heart that gave him his monstrous life, would be sufficient to bind the feral bloodline. He created a cage of power, but neglected to forge a key of will. He walked slowly toward the Yu basin. The oath must be an act of shared intent, not a transaction of life and death. The terms must be spoken in the ancient tongue, the lingua caelestis, and sealed by the mixture of the Kidan's power and the seer's blood. His language style was formal and highly descriptive. Alara followed, her small form utterly dwarfed by the obsidian chamber, yet she walked with the conviction of a person whose purpose had finally found its vessel. "The sight does not come without cost, Lord," she stated, her voice quiet but firm. "The vision I showed you of the reckoning, it is the price of failure. The raw power of my gift is what allows the binding to be redefined. My blood is the conduit for your new choice." She paused at the edge of the basin. "You must be the one to draw it. The act must be born of your deliberate intent, not my self-sacrifice." The intimate, high-stakes vulnerability of the dialogue was palpable. Cassian turned, the light from the covenant stone catching the sharp, beautiful planes of his face. He saw the necessity, the brutal, unromantic truth of her request. He was a predator, but she was forcing him to make his predatory act one of profound, world-altering choice. He reached into the folds of his immaculate dark coat and withdrew a long, thin object that caught the dim light. A silver needle, wickedly sharp, its hilt carved with the complex knotwork of the Kidan sigil. It was sparse and purposeful, an action that required no superfluous description. He extended his hand. Alara extended her own, laying it, palm up, on the cold lip of the Yu basin. Her skin was warm, vibrant with the life force he was perpetually sworn to protect. He did not hesitate. His movements were precise, chillingly efficient. He gripped the silver needle and swiftly pricked the center of her palm. A single, perfect bead of crimson rose instantly, startlingly bright against the paleness of her skin. Cassian watched the blood for a long moment, not with hunger, but with a profound, terrifying focus. He then, with the utmost care, guided her hand until the single, sacred bead of blood dripped into the wooden basin. The moment the blood touched the Yu, the atmosphere in the chamber changed violently. The low hum intensified into a roaring resonance. The covenant stone above them began to glow with a fierce, blinding intensity. The sensory details were overwhelming. The sudden, metallic scent of the blood, the blinding light, the terrifying sound of the released magic. The pacing was deliberately rhythmic, moving from slow-burn contemplation to a sudden, brutal action. Cassian stepped back, his voice now taking on a new quality, deep, ancient, and powerful, as he began to speak the lingua caelestis. The language was musical, resonant, and utterly foreign, conveying the weight of the ancient terminology. Text, ego Cassian, Kidan prime, per eius meum et onus aeternum, renuncio legem famis, non misericordiae sanbao. I, Cassian, first Kidan, by my right and eternal burden, renounce the law of hunger, not mercy. He spoke of his guilt and his self-hatred, but framed them as the necessary foundation for a new purpose. He spoke of the blood in the basin, calling it not an offering, but an anchor for his immense feral power. Alara watched him, the raw power of her gift surging in response to the ritualistic language. She was the isolated, apophatic female, and he was the guilt-burdened male, their duality the central force of the scene. When Cassian finished his ancient declaration, he turned to Alara, his stormy eyes burning with the raw, exposed intensity of his choice. He held out his hand, palm up, and she saw, with a shock, a long vertical scar running down the center of his palm, a pale, iridescent line against his marble skin. "Your turn, seer. Swear your bond." Alara placed her still bleeding palm over his, aligning the fresh wound with his ancient scar. The moment of contact was electric, a sudden, blinding flash of amber light that shot through the chamber and directly into the covenant stone. She began to speak her own oath, her voice clear, fierce, and absolute, responding to his language in the same lingua caelestis. Text: Ego Elara, Seer Sol, perdonum meum et voluntatem animum, accipio vinculum non. Dominium. I, Elara, seer of soul, by my gift and the will of my soul, accept the bond, not the mastery. She swore to be his anchor, to hold the moral line, and to use her sight to guide his power toward the redefinition of the covenant, not its destruction. She was not swearing fealty, but partnership, a high-stakes declaration of trust and intent. As she finished the final word, the chamber exploded with light. The covenant stone above them shattered into a million fragments of pure, blinding energy. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain. But where the stone had been, there was now a swirling vortex of deep, vibrant amber light, the color of Elara's eyes, mixing with a cold, glacial white, the color of Cassian's own power. The visual metaphor was stark, the shattering of the old, broken covenant and the forging of a new, volatile bond. A moment later, the light vanished entirely. Silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. The scent of ozone faded, replaced by the clean, cold scent of new fallen snow. The covenant stone was gone. In the center of the U basin, where the blood had dripped, a small, perfect circle of white ice had formed, and radiating out from it, a faint, pulsing amber light spread across the obsidian floor, a web of intricate, newly formed runework that covered the entire chamber. Elara and Cassian stood with their hands still joined, two figures defined by the contrast of their warmth and coldness, their fragility and immense power. Cassian looked at her, and the distance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a devastating, exposed intensity. He had surrendered his guilt and his loneliness, not for peace, but for a new, terrifying purpose. The covenant is broken, Elara of soul, he said, his voice now stripped of its formal reserve, intimate and raw. And the anchor is set. He held her gaze, the fiercely protective nature of his new bond surrounding them both. The Vrikolakas will feel this shift. They will know the covenant has been redefined, and they will come, not merely for blood, but for the one who dared to challenge the established law. He did not pull his hand away. Welcome to my eternal war, anchor. She had forced his choice, and now she was bound to its catastrophic consequences. The scene concluded with the declaration of the new high-stakes reality. Chapter 4. The sudden, catastrophic end of the ritual in the locust chamber sent an immediate seismic wave of understanding through the land. Not a physical tremor, but a profound, magical displacement that affected every creature bound by the old blood's covenant. The Vrikolakas, the feral, lesser strains, felt it as a sudden, agonizing severance, a snapping of the 1,000-year-old magical leash that had both starved and bound them to the northern wastes. The close third-person POV shifted briefly to the external antagonists, emphasizing the high-stakes escalation of the situation. Their madness, previously driven by cold and starvation, now curdled into a directed, incandescent fury. The focus of their siege shifted instantly from the passive desperation of the village to the active, volatile threat of Oakhaven Manor. Cassian and Elara emerged from the locust chamber into the relative warmth of the upper passages, their hands finally separated, but the bond between them a palpable, humming tension in the air. The silence of the manor, once a sign of his cold isolation, now felt like a fragile, temporary truce. The poetic and highly descriptive language centered on their physical proximity and the shift in their emotional tone. Cassian, in particular, was fundamentally altered. He moved with a renewed, terrible efficiency. the mantle of his ancient guilt replaced by the sharp, focused edge of protective intent. His still, marble beauty now seemed less like a monument to a tragic past and more like a weapon poised for immediate deployment. He led her not back to the desolate guest room, but directly to his own private library, a vast, high-ceilinged chamber that was the true nerve center of the manor. It was a space steeped in the dark academia aesthetic, walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound tomes in forgotten languages, illuminated by a massive wrought iron chandelier that held dozens of thick, guttering beeswax candles. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the faint mineral scent of his immortal body. "The first assault will come within the hour," Cassian stated, his voice now purely formal, his focus absolute. He moved to a large table where a map of the manor grounds, meticulously drawn in charcoal and ink, lay spread. They felt the anchor being set. They know the balance has shifted. They will test the new perimeter before the full siege begins. He was all action and strategy now, the philosophical dialogue temporarily suspended for the immediate need for survival. "Your role, Anchor, is to remain within the protection of the Locus's new rune work. You are the source of the rebinding. If they touch you, the magic is not merely broken, it is catastrophically reversed." Alara, despite the exhaustion of the ritual, felt a rush of adrenaline. Her conviction was absolute. "I did not swear the oath to hide, Lord. The prophecy spoke of a siege, but also of a shared site." She moved to the table, her small hand tracing the perimeter lines on the map with startling confidence. "The runes are binding the Vrikolakas to a new law, one of choice and consequence, but they will not understand it. They will see the light of the new locus and believe it is a source of power to be consumed." She shifted the political dynamics of the confrontation. "My sight is now tied to your strength. I can feel the patterns of their movement, the direction of their madness. My utility is not defensive, it is strategic." Cassian paused, his eyes sweeping over her face. He saw the truth in her statement, the raw, untapped potential of her newly anchored gift. His initial instinctual need to protect her by isolation warred with the pragmatic recognition of her tactical value. The conflict was internal, a key character element, trust versus preservation. "Show me," he commanded, the word attest. "If your sight is merged with my power, demonstrate its accuracy. Where will they strike first?" Alara closed her eyes, allowing the vast, cool current of his shared power to flow into her, amplifying her own gift 1,000-fold. The new rune work in the manor, invisibly woven into the very structure of the walls and floors, pulsed in her mind's eye. She saw the manor's massive, ornate iron gates, the initial point of vulnerability. But beyond the gates, in the dense, skeletal blackness of the ironwoods, she saw a focused, malevolent movement, a wave of lesser blood driven by a leader with a frighteningly singular, violent intelligence. "Not the gates," she whispered, her voice strained. "They are sending a vanguard, a focused strike team led by an older, more calculating mind. The north wall by the old service entrance. The stones there are weak, and the angle of the hill provides them cover." She pointed to a specific, almost hidden spot on the map, a place Cassian himself had not checked in over a decade. Cassian stared at the map, then at her, a shadow of profound respect crossing his marble features. "The service entrance," he murmured. "It has been unused for 3 centuries. Only I and my retainer know of its structural integrity." He moved with sudden, decisive speed. "You have bought us time, Anchor, but the redefinition of the Covenant must be completed. We need the full strength of the locus to radiate outward, to encompass the entire siege perimeter." He grabbed a heavy, leather-bound book from a shelf, an ancient grimoire bound in iron and smelling of ash. "The complete activation sequence is complex. You are the only one who can read the lingua celestis fluently, Seer. You must interpret, and I must execute. The division of labor, The high-stakes collaboration was now absolute. Elara stood by the map, the heavy, archaic book open before her, the complexity of the ancient languages challenging her focus. Cassian moved through the library, pulling down specific components, arcane tools, and prepared vials of potent, magically charged fluids. The sudden, brutal action was the preparation itself, the rush of adrenaline against the profound weight of their task. The first step, Elara read aloud, her voice regaining its steady, formal tone, is the Hyamalis sanguis, the winter blood. She translated the ancient terminology with clinical precision. It requires the sacrifice of a portion of your own core power, Lord, not merely as a magical discharge, but as a deliberate, directed infusion into the northern perimeter's runework. You must allow your true nature to flow into the earth itself. She looked at him, the intimate vulnerability now shared between them. It will weaken you momentarily. It is the cost of the choice. Cassian was already at the wall, pulling aside a section of ancient tapestry to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a large, ornate silver basin. He looked at her, his lips curving into a grim, dark-humored smile, the only humor acceptable in this Gothic narrative. I have been weak for 1,000 years, seer. This time, my weakness will serve a purpose. He lifted a small, wickedly curved obsidian dagger, a ritualistic tool, and without hesitation drew it swiftly across the pale, unblemished skin of his inner forearm. The blood that welled up was not the simple, coppery red of a human, but a thick, obsidian-black liquid that smoked faintly in the air. The visual cue focused on the inhuman nature of the supernatural. The scent of his blood, so near and so potent, was a profound sensory challenge for Elara. It was the purest form of the old blood, a smell that should have driven her to instinctual, fearful submission. But the anchor held. She smelled only power, cold and ancient, imbued with a terrible sense of purpose. Cassian held his arm over the silver basin, allowing the dark fluid to pool. The vanguard will be at the service door within 10 minutes, he stated, his voice strained from the self-inflicted wound. We must work faster, Elara. The price of slowness is the entire manse. The pacing was now intensely rhythmic, alternating between the deliberate, sensory-rich process of the ritual and the short, impactful dialogue lines of the imminent action. Elara read the next step, her mind racing. The second step is the Ignis Custos, the guardian fire. The Hyamalis sanguis must be mixed with the ash of the burnt covenant and ignited by a human spark, a flash of pure, unadulterated will. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with the realization of what was required. It needs a conduit who has faced death without fear, whose choice is absolute. She knew, with chilling certainty, that it meant her. The revelation of the mystery, her true nature, was unfolding in real time. Cassian stared at the obsidian blood welling in the basin. He understood. The oath had bound his power to her will. He had chosen to surrender his isolation, and now the magic demanded the absolute conviction of the one who forced that choice. He moved to her, his face a mask of fierce, exposed protectiveness. If this fails, Elara, the fire will consume your light. This is not the slow death of the sacrifice. This is the erasure of the seer. Are you willing to pay the cost of your conviction? She placed her hands on the cold silver edge of the basin, directly above the pool of his black, smoking blood. She looked up at him, her expression a combination of melancholy and fierce resolve. I fear the death I cannot prevent, Lord. You are the anchor. My will is the spark. Let us meet. Lahi, the siege with the new law. Her hand shot out, grabbing a handful of fine gray ash from a small iron urn on the table, the ashes of the original covenant stone, saved by Cassian's ancient retainer. She dropped the ash into the pool of his blood. The dark fluid immediately began to hiss and froth. Elara closed her eyes and, with an intense, silent focus, poured every fragment of her terror, her isolation, and her immense, hard-won conviction into the mixture. The sheer force of her will, the human spark, hit the mixture. There was no gentle flare. The blood and ash combusted in a sudden, violent roar of cold, silver-white flame, a fire that radiated pure, freezing light but no heat. The sensory overload was complete, focusing on the stark contrast of light and shadow, the cold fire, and the liquid grace of the supernatural. Cassian watched the fire, a terrible, profound realization settling over him. He was no longer alone. He was bound. The siege had begun, not with a clash of swords, but with an act of devastating shared ritual. The immediate high-stakes combat was now imminent, and the two protagonists, the vampire guardian and the prophetic human, stood together, framed by the cold, white flames of their newly forged covenant. The final words of the chapter were a clear, dramatic statement of the impending external conflict. Chapter 5, The Silver-White Flame in the Basin, the Ignis Kustos, did not die down. Instead, it began to shimmer, detaching itself from the physical vessel and flowing like a sentient stream of light across the polished library floor. It followed the intricate, invisible path of the locus's new runework, which Alara could now see with crystalline clarity, a vast, energetic web that spread throughout the entire manor and its surrounding grounds. This visual metaphor of the skeletal branches and the new, vibrant light represented the infusion of her life force into his immortal fortress. The energy surged outward, a silent, binding mandate. The redefinition of the covenant was complete. Outside, the Vrikolaka's vanguard, a focused force of hulking, desperate monsters, was already scrambling up the heavily forested slope toward the ancient service entrance, driven by the cold fury of their newly snapped leash. Their leader, a creature known only as Karthos, an older strain whose madness was tempered by a cunning cruelty, felt the sudden, profound shift in the magical landscape. The binding force was still present, but it was different. It was no longer a choke chain, it was a law, a terrifying choice laid bare before them. The external conflict was now clearly driven by the character-driven political thriller aspect. Inside the library, Cassian was already moving, his movements the epitome of liquid grace. The moment the Ignis Kustos had stabilized, he retrieved a long, beautiful sword, a family relic with a dark, silvered blade etched with the same ancient knotwork that marked his lineage. He strapped the weapon to his back with the chilling efficiency of a soldier preparing for a lost war. The sensory detail focused on his inhuman stillness and lethal grace. He turned to Alara, his eyes burning with the cold, focused light of battle. The runework is active, Anchor. Every creature that crosses the perimeter now faces a choice: submission to the newly anchored Kadan or the consequence of obliteration. The magic does not distinguish between feral and disciplined. It only recognizes the will of the locus. He spoke the language of the high-stakes political thriller. You are the heart of that will. I go to meet their vanguard. Alara stepped forward, ignoring the faint tremor of exhaustion. The binding is based on my conviction, Lord. If you fight for mere preservation, the effect will be temporary. You must fight to enforce the new law. You must offer them the choice. Her dialogue was high value and sparse, a final, necessary philosophical conflict, mercy versus nature before the action. Karthos is calculating. He will not rush into true destruction. He will test your resolve, Lord. He wants to prove that the Kadan remains the monster he always was. Cassian stopped at the massive oak door, his hand resting on the intricately carved handle. He looked back at her, the fiercely protective emotion in his eyes startlingly raw. You demand a terrible mercy, Anchor, to kill with a purpose higher than simple self-defense. He accepted the charge. You will remain here. The runework of the library is concentrated. Your physical safety is the priority. The moment you feel the runework falter, the moment the light recedes, you must retreat to the locust chamber. He was laying down the foundation for trust in the face of immense danger. He opened the door and stepped out into the shadowed hallway. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The library had been a haven of warm light and old books. The hallway was a long, dark stretch of cold stone, illuminated only by the stark contrast of light and shadow filtering from the distant, high windows. The siege had begun. Cassian moved through the manor like a phantom, utterly silent, his senses tuned to the subtle shift of the energy field. He felt the malignant presence of the Vrikolaka's vanguard pressing against the northern wall. He reached the service entrance, a heavy, ironclad door set deep into a buttress of old stone. He did not open it. He simply waited, standing motionless, a marble statue of imminent, lethal power. A moment later, a sound of grating stone and heavy, desperate muscle echoed from outside. The Vrykolakas were using ancient, improvised tools to pry at the door's iron locks. The rhythm of the action was deliberately slow, building the tension. Cassian did not move. He waited for the threshold violation, the moment the new law came into effect. The door burst inward with a sickening, splintering crash. The first creature to enter was a massive, stooped monster of pure feral muscle, its eyes blazing with red hunger. The moment its clawed foot crossed the threshold, the runework engaged. The air around the creature did not merely grow cold, it became a paralyzing field of pure glacial magic. The creature froze, its body contorted in the act of attack, a grotesque statue caught in the act of violence. Cassian spoke, his voice low, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, echoing the formal language style. Hear the new law, lesser blood. The covenant of hunger is replaced by the covenant of choice. You may enter the locus and submit to the new Kaidan's law, a life of moderated sustenance and guided purpose, or you may advance and face the consequence of the anchor's will, obliteration. He was speaking the language of ancient politics. The second creature hesitated, its red eyes flickering with a moment of terrifying primal intelligence. It smelled the anchor, the strong, pure scent of human blood infused with a staggering cold power, and the scent was a profound conflict. It looked past the frozen body of its comrade and saw Cassian not as a predator, but as the final, absolute judge. But Karthos, the cunning leader, was not among the first wave. From the shadowed woods outside, a low, rasping voice carried through the breach. The Kaidan speaks of law. You, the broken oath, the eternal coward, you feed us your philosophy, but deny us the sustenance of the hunt. You hide behind the blood of a child seer. Your choice is a lie. The dialogue was used to reveal deep character conflict and world-changing information. Cassian moved with terrifying speed, drawing the ancient sword and driving the point through the chest of the frozen creature, a swift, brutal act. The creature did not bleed, it simply crumbled into a fine, black ash. Consequence, Cassian stated, the word a final, absolute sentence. The sudden, brutal action was decisive. He turned toward the open breach in the wall. Outside, the remaining 4 creatures of the vanguard, including the massive, hunched form of Karthos, watched in stunned, terrified silence. They had seen their comrade, a powerful lesser strain, reduced to ash by a touch of the Kaidan's focused power. Karthos finally moved, not with an attack, but with a sudden, devastating burst of speed, not toward the manor, but toward the perimeter of the magical field. He intended to circle, to find the weak point, to prove that the Kaidan was still alone, still operating under the failed mandate of the old covenant. Cassian, however, was anchored. He felt the shift in Karthos's intent, a silent warning from the locust runework. They are trying to flank the field. Ilara's voice, amplified by the runework, echoed in his mind, clear and sharp. She was seeing through his eyes, through the magical current that bound them. Karthos believes he can circumvent the law. He is heading for the old well house, the point of the weakest magical convergence. You must meet him at the edge of the runework, Lord. Cassian felt a sudden, terrifying warmth flood his core, the raw, volatile energy of Alara's amplified sight. The bond was working perfectly. He was no longer fighting alone, relying on brute force. He was fighting with a unified, strategic will. He turned and shot out of the manor's breach, moving with a velocity that blurred his marble form. The pacing accelerated, the action lines becoming sparse and purposeful. He intercepted Karthos at the edge of the tree line, just as the lesser vampire was about to step beyond the influence of the new locus. The meeting was a clash of ancient, brutal power. Karthos was sheer, rabid strength. Cassian was elegant, focused lethality, his sword a silvered flash in the gloom. The combat was sudden and brutal, the poetic description focusing on the coldness and liquid grace of the Kedan. Your anchor screams its presence, Kedan, Karthos roared, his voice thick with madness and hatred. Give us the seer, and we will forget this foolish law. We will return to the familiar horror of the old covenant. Cassian blocked a blow that would have shattered his collarbone, the sheer force of it pushing him back a foot. The old covenant is ash, he stated, his voice a low, terrifying growl. The law is non-negotiable. Submit or be erased. The brutal fight continued, a flurry of impossible speed and immense strength. Cassian, though momentarily weakened by the Himali's sanguis ritual, fought with the terrifying focus that only a newly found purpose could grant. He was fighting not only to survive, but to uphold the choice he had made, the choice that had ended his 1,000 years of terrible, isolating guilt. The dark, self-deprecating irony was gone, replaced by a fierce, driving conviction. He was the anchor, and she was his purpose. The escalation was absolute.